It could be. I'm gonna have to steal it from you and use it at my next conference. Uncaptain this I have because I can work.
Welcome to the neighbor home. Oh, I feel like I have a lot of mouths already. Okay. Hello.
It's a little thing right here, just for. It doesn't.
Hello.
Yeah. It's,
Okay. Good morning, everybody. How is everyone doing this morning? This is the behavioral health track. The session is Sacred Wisdom, the Path to Hope, Balance, and Resilience. Our next presenter is Dr. Tommy Begay, and I will give a brief introduction. Dr. Tommy Begay is a research assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry, College of Medicine, University of Arizona. He's a cultural psychologist by academic training, focusing on the interrelationship of cultural biology and environment to understand human behavior as applicable to health and wellness. Dr. Begay possesses a Master's of Public Health degree with a specialty in international health. His research interests include indigenous health and assessing the neurophysiological impact of adverse childhood stress, especially in relation to historical trauma and the impact to contemporary health of indigenous populations. Dr. Begay is a faculty member with the Sleep and Health Research Program and serves as faculty affiliate with the Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience Laboratory. Both are entities of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Arizona. He's originally from Dianita, the Navajo Nation, and currently resides in Tucson, Arizona. Welcome, Dr. Begay. Thank you.
thank you. That was an awesome introduction. Now you can take a breath. I apologize for that super long paragraph. I usually, it usually gets whittled down pretty much. But Yate Tommy Begay, Yanishye, Shee Hashlishni, Nishlito, Todichini, Bashishchin. That's my relation. I have a couple of relatives in the back that are also of the Dene, as we call ourselves, the Navajo people. Navajo is a Spanish word, so that's we call ourselves Dene, our relatives. We consist of help me out with this, brother. 8 original clans, maybe 4 original clans, and so my maternal clan is Hashlishni, the Mud Clan. My paternal clan is Todichini, the Bitterwater clan. And so this kind of helps us sort out relatives. And I just got finished rewatching Game of Thrones, all 8 seasons, and there was a lot of weird things going on between families. And one of the aspects of clanship is that there are certain clans that we are allowed to date and we're allowed to have relations with. So that's the importance. But more I guess important for me is that my identity, my connection to my roots in northeastern Arizona. The Deneta is what we call our land, the Navajo Nation, and we have a rich history, as most of my indigenous brothers and sisters have, related to historical trauma. And this presentation will focus on sort of the cause, or in my opinion, I'm going to emphasize hypotheses, because it's still in science we talk about a hypothesis or what we think is going on. but the evidence in terms of research or whatever study we decide to do, that will point to this indeed happened. So we're still, if the science community, especially for Indigenous people, are still looking at that evidence piece. And so the work that I do is the sort of the beginning of that. So as mentioned, I'm affiliated with the Department of Psychiatry, the College of Medicine at the University of Arizona in Tucson. We oftentimes call it Tucson. Actually, my relatives, the Autonomic Nation, they have a tribe along the Mexico-Arizona border. They refer to Tucson as Tucson, and we have a mountain to the west. And usually summertime, we're looking at like 112 degrees, 110 degrees. And as they say, we love to say it's a dry heat. It's different than the humidity. But right now we're in monsoon season, so our temperatures are lowered. But man, flash floods, just a lot of brown water flowing in our dry streams, as well as Navajo Nation. I was up in Deneta, the Navajo Nation, last week. I visited 2 schools. I was also with the San Carlos Apache tribe in terms of looking at empowering youth with a high school club, a high school program that's based upon a lot of the sacred wisdom that I talk about. And it's really from a Dene perspective, from a Navajo perspective, it's that's the Navajo blessing way. It's our worldview, but I take it as a psychology. And it's part of me here in Nashville. It's part of me wherever I decide to go. That's the psychology that I focus on, not necessarily the 4 sacred mountains of Navajo, not necessarily the activity of ceremony or prayer, but really the psychology that I carry with me wherever I'm at. So that's the sacred wisdom that I would like to present. I'm a cultural psychologist, and really what that entails is whatever we do, activities out here, changes the brain. We might call it neuromodulation. We might call it neurodevelopment with children, or we might just simply call it behavior modification if we want to change behaviors, the external activities out here. We've got to change the neural pathways, or the neurons that really define what behavior is. I'm originally from Window Rock, which is the capital of the Navajo Nation. And I was born in a place called Fort Defiance. It was actually a cavalry camp that marched the Navajo, the beginning of marching the Navajo to southern New Mexico. We refer to that as the Long Walk. And we are survivors. Over a period of time, the Navajo were just released, and we walked back, we migrated back to our sacred lands of Deneta, which is surrounded by the 4 sacred mountains. So that's the personal relationship to historical trauma. But I also want to kind of just highlight my journey, my own personal journey. I'm probably 18 units shy of a master's degree in biochemistry. And well, what happened, man? Well, I did biochemistry to get into medical school. And once I got into medical school, what's the deal here? I don't need to spend another semester with a biochemistry program. So I have 2 years of medical school. And I was a little dissatisfied with the school at the University of Arizona, which is really pharmacologically based. In other words, the emphasis is on really drugs and utilization of pharmacy in terms of healthcare. And as you'll learn a little bit, few slides down the road here, I come from a family of healers. I come from my great grandmother was a medicine woman, Bat Sosi. Yeah, we always say yeah when the person has passed away, like used to be. And so she has really set the influence of my psychosocial health perspective today, wherever I'm at, with my psychology. So it's something I think that we all have the capacity to share and be meaning that this is part of our fiber, part of our genetics, part of where we come from and what we do. So So I have a background in sciences. So I often get asked by some of our neuroscience undergraduates, wow, man, I'd like to do what you're doing now. You know, what program did you go into? And I have to tell this story that, you know, it wasn't one program. It wasn't at the University of Arizona. It's been, first of all, you know, and as I'll get to also a few slides down the road, I survived. I think a lot of us survived. the impact of childhood abuse and domestic violence. And this has really sort of set off some behavior patterns that are associated with this thing we call health disparities of the American Indian and the Alaska Native. So this has always been an interest of mine in sort of that move from biochemistry to medical school and from medical school to being a cultural psychologist. And a little bit about the cultural psychology. Again, the changes, the physiological, that also entails function and morphology, which is the cellular changes that occur. Everything we do out here, something happens or changes here. And so the two work together. I cannot just look at physiology, nor can I just look at culture. They work together. Okay, so that's my worldview, that's my perspective, and that's what I take with me as I present this information. So my research focus is actually is really adverse, looking at the impact of adverse childhood stress. And there's a science now, adverse childhood experiences. We know a little bit about what happens to children as a result of abuse, neglect, and just witnessing violence, witnessing domestic violence. These changes occur to the brain, but as a child survives that environment, that also opens the door for some other health conditions that are related to inflammation, that are related to psychiatric outcomes, depression, substance abuse, suicide, the completed act of suicide, but the thought of that maybe death is better than living through the hell that I'm living through now. So this is again, a condition. I'm sort of moving upstream to better understand what happened to Tommy. And the part of the story is Tommy's had his moments of darkness also. There was probably 10 years I spent living through or moving through an alcoholic blackout where I was I held a job. I was in the College of Public Health. I was in the College of Medicine. I had a position, but I was just like I said, I was in a blackout just about every other night. And what scared me is having being stopped and having this in Arizona. We have the extreme DUI, and that's a blood alcohol concentration of 2 times the legal limit. And 0.08 is the legal limit, BAC in Arizona. So I had my last 2 drinking episodes in 2009. Within 4 months, I had blown a 0.24. That's 3 times. 3 times higher than the legal limit of blood alcohol concentration. And I began, the reality set in that, this was going to continue on. And I had to, my greatest fear was a head-on collision with a family that had nothing to do with me. My greatest fear was killing a child that's on a bicycle or crossing the street. And so I checked into a county-run residential rehab program in Tucson, and I did the whole friggin' thing. I did the 12-step program. I reconnected with my own spirituality, with my great-grandmother, her teachings, and with Sweat Lodge. And so what I experienced out of that is not something I read, the textbooks in the College of Medicine at the University of Arizona. This is something that I've lived through, and see the value and really advocate for the use and reconnection to sacred wisdom from a psychological perspective, from a neuroscientific perspective. As I'll mention a little bit down a few slides more, that I really focus on the neuroscience and the various aspects of the autonomic nervous system, that fight or flight mechanism, the sympathetic nervous system, which I think runs amok in these kind of environments, and the parasympathetic nervous system, that place of peace, that place of calm, that place of ceremony, that place of prayer. So my great-grandmother, as a healer, as a medicine woman, advocated for what she called natural order. Natural order is, in my opinion, or in my perspective, homeostasis or balance. What goes up needs to come down. If something is always up, like that the childhood abuse or these environments where it's highly stressful, highly fearful, the nervous system doesn't get a chance to come down. And that's what creates the problems in regard to inflammation, in regard to excessive cortisol, which changes our immune system. It's, we have We have glucocorticoid receptors in our immune system that get augmented, they get changed, and so I'm getting a little bit ahead of the story here, but there are changes that lead to a pro-inflammatory reaction as adults, because cortisol is usually an anti-inflammatory. We can go to our local Walgreens. Do they have Walgreens here in Nashville? I'm sure they have them all over the world, but you can go to Walgreens and buy hydrocortisone, and that's a synthetic cortisol. It will relieve your inflammation. That's the way we are designed as human beings or as biological organisms is when we have a stressor, there's a stress response, we release cortisol, but it's acute, it's once in a while. We're not the body, in times of chronic stress, that anti-inflammatory process becomes a pro-inflammatory process. In other words, every little stress, whether it's something you think about or something you live through, releases this stress response system with the outcome of cortisol, and that creates a pro-inflammatory process affecting heart disease, affecting stroke of the brain, but also there's a sympathetic nervous system that's associated with adrenaline, and we get this all the time. This becomes what I'm trying to imitate is hyperarousal, hypervigilance, and we got to do something with this. Maybe we decide to numb out and self-medicate with some drug or with food or with some activity, whatever satisfies nucleus accumbens in coordination with what we call the ventral tegmental area, or basically the pleasure centers of the brain. Those things we're going to engage in. Without, this is a very subtle process. That we don't have advanced biochemistry in our elementary schools or in our high schools to teach people that there's going to be changes to the brain that are going to occur, and that change is basically addiction. Addiction you can't walk away from because you are physiologically connected to a substance, whatever that is. And if you stop that substance, you could create physiological damage to so there's a process that, the process of rehabilitation, there's a process of recovery. And that recovery process is living without that substance that you were addicted to. So what I'm getting at, and we heard this morning, that there's an unresolved fear or pain that gets people to begin to engage in self-medication. And it's the self-medicating process that leads to these health disparities downstream. And even food, I love a good all-you-can-eat buffet every now and then. But I will go there and I will see people self-medicating with food. I mean, they will sit there for hours and just eat and eat. And it's that feel-good mechanism. I mean, we have comfort foods. I'm sure we've all heard in our own cultures and our own places what a comfort food is, but they're usually rich in fats for survival purposes. But it's those comfort foods that we can use to also self-medicate fear and pain. So again, all this slide says is that this chronic stress or this toxic stress leads to changes to the brain. And I usually, when I have more time, I run like 3 or 4 different slides of groups that are doing this type of research, looking at the changes to the brain that occur. And for the sake of time, I'm usually allowed 2 or 3 hours to talk about this stuff. But really, the 2 areas I want to just focus in the middle here. The next slide is really sort of looking at the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and the outcome is cortisol. This is the stress response system. In addition to blood sugar gets released. That's ready. We're ready to fight. We're ready to run. We're ready. Our bodies are getting ready for that fearful situation. But we can even, our prefrontal cortex, or this part of the brain right behind my forehead, is responsible for executive functioning. So we can even think about stressful situations. I can sit here and think about if I went through at 120 miles per hour, MPH, if I went through at 120 miles per hour through a school zone, and I'm standing in front of the judge, and the judge is looking at me saying, "What the heck, dude?" I'll get sweaty palms. My heart will start to beat fast. And we can just think about those stressful situations. But the opposite's true too. We can think of peaceful places. We can think of ceremony, and we can bring our sympathetic nervous system down. Sympathetic nervous system is associated with the parasympathetic nervous system, but they belong under the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic rhymes with automatic. Our breathing, our heart rate, peristalsis, the movement of digestive materials through our, our midsection. All of that is controlled by autonomic. We don't need to think about it, but there are certain external forces like stress that'll either turn on or turn off autonomic functions. So that's the focus that I have, again, with neuroscience, but also the biological or neurophysiological outcomes. And as I mentioned before, that sympathetic nervous system is associated with hypervigilance, hyperarousal. I know you're dying to hear me snap my fingers again, but I won't do it. But you get the point that we can't turn this on and off because it's an autonomic response. So we learn to self-medicate. And so hypervigilance, hyperarousal, but I also, as the title of this talk, the sacred wisdom, the body, the mind, the brain has also the healing capacity or the capability to heal itself. I think that sometimes in our own cultures, we depend upon external medications, or maybe it's that guy with the white coat with the stethoscope around his neck to take care of us, as opposed to we taking care of ourselves. But it's really easy because of excessive fear and excessive pain to fall into certain behaviors that soon we find ourselves either addicts or living out or carrying out addiction or addictive behaviors, and then we're stuck in a life or death situation, depending on what the substance is that we're addicted to. So I talked about hypothesis. I think of the first 30 seconds. These are some of the historical traumatic events that I believe all Indigenous people around the world are going through or have gone through, depending on where we're at geographically. So we have community massacres, genocidal policies, forced relocation, the prohibition of cultural practices, and what I think has done the whammy to Indigenous people, especially in this country, the forced removal of children through boarding school practices. At one time, it was federal education policy: kill the Indian, save the man. Children were forcefully removed from their families. And not everybody, as we also heard this morning, not everybody experienced this traumatic, negative experience. For some individuals, this was a positive experience. This was something that they learned or grew out, depending on what boarding school that individual had that experience. But sort of, we have a tendency to just focus on what's downstream. This again, this makes up what I refer to as those health disparities: chronic diseases, hyperarousal, hypervigilance, which is also associated with agitation, anger, and violence. Again, when we experience this all the time, it's really easy to little Johnny Ozzie drops his milk. It's really easy to take that anger or that agitation out on little Johnny Ozzie, and then we got a cycle. Once something gets excited, it gets accepted in the home. Once something gets accepted in the community, it becomes, the culture has changed. People no longer bat an eye or care about it. And in some places, this is the way I see domestic violence. No one cares about domestic violence anymore, or the use of violence in communities that's associated, again, with an overstimulated sympathetic nervous system. Overstimulated, and just like any muscle, that's one part I forgot to mention. The biological systems operate by the more we do something, the more it grows. Just like we go to the weight room, I'm exercising my bicep. The more times I do my bicep curl, I'm going to get stronger. Instead of the 5 pounds, I'm going to have to use a 10-pounder. And then as I begin to do that, my body responds to it. That's the same thing that happens with our nervous system. Our nervous system changes because of that sympathetic arousal of fear and pain in the household. So you can imagine this as little Johnny Ozzie is 6 years old, 5 years old, and mom and dad are still together for 20 years. The changes to the nervous system that occur, the changes to that sympathetic nervous system. And that's why this becomes, the go-to mechanism that hijacks the rest of the brain. Okay, so that's, I did mention earlier the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and cortisol, and also the adrenaline that's released for sympathetic nervous system. But ultimately, PTSD is a memory disorder. I mean, that's the way I see it. I could talk to a physician, he'll tell me otherwise, or a psychiatrist for that matter. But PTSD is that something happened to us, fear or pain or trauma. but it happens at a subconscious level. In other words, we may get some type of external stimuli, something we hear, something we taste, something we see, and yet it activates our stress response system, all that cortisol again. We can't figure out why. So this notion of just don't think about it just doesn't work, because this is a subconscious process. Okay. So, and even, again, this is a whole science of looking at complex trauma and also historical trauma. We're starting to, again, really look at memory and how memory comes, declarative memory, episodic memory, those things that happen are conscious parts of memory. They run through a part of the brain called the hippocampus. The subconscious parts are more emotional memories and like trauma or even good things. We'll find ourselves in a place, and maybe we were with somebody we really enjoyed being with, and we'll be in that place and we'll relive those positive experiences over again. But the other part of subconscious memory also leads to what athletes do. There is that part of the brain where we have to be mindful. We have to, let's just use baseball. We have to see that ball coming. We begin to take a swing at it. We miss it by 2 yards, man. We missed the whole thing, but over a period of time, we strengthen the neurons that run from our muscles up to our brain, and we get a little bit closer to hitting that ball. And then one of these days, boom, we make contact, and we keep doing that over and over and over again, so it becomes a new habit. And that's the behavioral modification, is that we become mindful. Riding a bike is another good example, but eventually that becomes more subconscious, or a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. And so if we want to change behavior, we got to start with being mindful to the point where it just becomes a reaction. If you throw me a baseball, I don't know if I could actually do this, I should be able to catch it. I should, without even having to, process it through my hippocampus and all the other conscious parts of the brain. Now, this is a heavy science. It takes a couple of years of classes to really begin to understand this mechanism. But I just want to kind of put it out there in terms of why situations are the way they are in certain places, specifically the health disparities of the American Indian, the Alaska Native, or people around the world, and how that's associated with historical trauma, but now today, more intergenerational maladaptive practices that are related to parenting, that are related to interpersonal communication mechanisms. In other words, we don't need an outsider to do this to us. We're doing this to ourselves inside of our communities based upon what we've learned, based upon the changes to our nervous system. But the outcome, again, are these health disparities further downstream. So as a cultural psychologist, this is really sort of the process. How did historical trauma, equate to to these health disparities that we see in many of our communities? So that's the task. And so I just, part of my dissertation was to really look at these acts of genocide, or what we call historical traumatic events, had led to this cultural disconnect. And now this is the cycle that's happening. And we're, as I mentioned before, we're at this lower left-hand corner, intergenerational, self-perpetuating, self-inflicting coping or maladaptive coping behaviors that are also associated with other cultural historical factors such as poverty, such as racism, and even today in our current political climate of outsiders that don't look like, one group, and the fight to try to get those outsiders out just based upon skin color. So there's a lot of stress and a lot of trauma that continue to allow this to happen. But I also see this, this outlet of reconnecting with self-identity and feeling good about my history. I'm very fortunate to be alive. I survived almost being decapitated in 1985. I mean, my whole left side of my face was gone. This is the zygomatic process, my cheekbone. I have a little hole on this side. They actually drilled a hole through my face to hold up this zygomatic process for 3 years. And I was in this halo. I was like, my spinal cord was fused. Cervical vertebrae 6 was fractured, almost touched my spinal cord. Had it touched my spinal cord, I'd probably be in a wheelchair right now. But the fact of the matter is, that these survival mechanisms. There is a way, and that way is really sort of looking at satisfying or reconnecting with parasympathetic activities to begin that healing, that self-healing process. So I think that with the high schools that I mentioned earlier, visiting, maybe I didn't mention, I had a conversation earlier today, but these are the areas that I'm two high schools that I'm working with to really sort of begin to look or fuse the assets and the resources of higher education. In other words, we're going to look at the research process and apply that to community health problems. Again, two reasons. One, if they move on to higher education, you're going to see it. And the other is that we can begin to resolve some of our community health problems, even if it's to address the impact of domestic violence or childhood abuse in our communities. We don't have to name names here. We just need to put the problem out there, and maybe even have a weekly, monthly radio spot that these kids can begin to talk about these issues. And it just doesn't have to be social or cultural or even traumatic or trauma. It can be about the groundwater. It can be about the solid waste, but you have a mechanism of the research process. And that would also entail, teaching about anatomy, about neuroscience, to get these kids engaged, to use these tools, the weapons, as I'll get to soon, the essence of sacred wisdom is really sort of the blessing way, which consists of, again, the arrowhead and the corn pollen, that sacredness, and that we connect with. Again, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but really, some of us have seen this. But really, what I think we don't really understand is this is what sets it off for a lot of us, for a lot of our communities. But there is a cultural augmentation component, that acceptance of certain behaviors, that we no longer bat an eye, that dad's beating up mom, or we don't bat an eye anymore, that we might even encourage our kids to fight other kids. But the violence, the changes to culture in some of our places, the battle has changed. We no longer need to use bows and arrows and rifles and our fists. The war is here. The war, again, the battle to achieve peace, but also to think of utilizing these new tools, these new elements of higher education, of the research process, of understanding what has happened to our people, what has happened, that self-identity component, and being good with it. Just as I realize and look in the mirror and see these scars on my face and realize that I've been through a dark place, but that without those activities, without that part of my life, I might not be as motivated as I am to study and learn more about the impact of historical trauma, but really what intergenerational trauma is doing today. But now, from a health disparity perspective, the individual outcomes and how this leads to early death, disease, disability, social problems, the adaptation of risky behaviors, such as driving while drunk, especially if you're driving with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.24 or higher, which is, we had an incident in Gallup, New Mexico. Some of you might have read in the newspaper, where there was a man that ran through, a Navajo man that ran through a parade, a nightly parade, and he had a blood alcohol concentration of 0.24. So he has no idea. He was in a blackout driving his car through a parade of traditional dancers of the Southwest, the great Gallup Intertribal Ceremonial Parade. So these things happen in our backyards. They happen on a daily basis. So the quest for me, anyway, is to understand further upstream so that we can begin to address these issues instead of throwing money at more physicians or more healthcare facilities, which I mean no disrespect. We need those facilities, but I also think that we need to see what has happened in terms of culture, in terms of violence, in terms of substance abuse. So as I mentioned before, the areas of the brain that I really focus on, the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system. The prefrontal cortex, by the way, is the executive functioning part. We do bus schedules, we do calculus, but it's the last part of the brain to fully develop. It matures at age 25 in the adult. So you can imagine little Johnny Ozzie, as I mentioned, he's being bombarded with fear and pain as a child. He's now really being driven by this more reptilian part, this autonomic nervous system of the brain stem, which again, for survival purposes is important. You know, you take a lizard, the lizard doesn't care how big you are and whether or not you want to kill it. All it knows is it needs to get the heck out of there, and it flies. Isn't it funny? I use the lizard term from the Southwest. It could be a mouse. It could be anything that's bigger. But my point is, it's not trying to figure out whether or not it wants to hurt you. It just wants to survive. So that's why we refer to that as the reptilian part of the brain. But that also, these children that now become adults, this is the world that they live in now because it's been overdeveloped because of the environment, the input and impact of the environment. And so, you know, the limbic system is our emotional, our fear, pain, coordination. There are several structures involved with that. And this is that, again, that place of habit, the basal ganglia, again, consisting of several structures. But if we want to change behavior, we got to be mindful. We got to think about the movement. This is the basis of sports camps. When you go to a sports camp, you usually have some all-star, you know, guy telling you how to throw a ball, but he's done it enough times. He's an all-star. He knows the proper form of throwing a ball. So we listen to him and we do it enough times, and pretty soon we're throwing a ball just like he did. But that's the essence of change of behavior, is to get to this point here where it's just a reaction. We don't have to think about it. In fact, thinking about it slows us down by a microsecond. Athletes, you know, Michael Jordan, he's got 2 seconds left in the game and he makes this incredible shot almost upside down, and he makes it, you know, because he's been doing that a lot of time. He doesn't think about it. If you talk to these athletes, they don't, that's all a response. And the same with, you know, where I grew up, you know, we have rodeos. You know, I used to rodeo for the University of Arizona. I was a bull rider and a saddle bronc rider. You cannot, I mean, it's all about mindfulness training to the point where it's just a reaction. And it's not a reaction you see, it's what your body feels. You know, I used to, my uncles used to crack me up. They say, well, when you get on a bull, you got to look at here, you got to do this, you got to do that. No, that is, if you look at there and look at there, it takes too much time. By the time you make that move, you're in the dirt. So it's all about how that reaction, just again, if you throw me a ball, I've done it so many times, I'll catch it. And the other thing is my kids are now in their 30s. And every now and then we get on the basketball court and they bring their friends and they always say, oh, lucky old man, you know, and I make a shot. But they don't know how many years I spent playing. And so it's just so much a part of my nervous system that it's just that reaction again. And everything in life is like that. The good stuff and the bad stuff. So what do we do about the bad stuff? Well, we be mindful and we focus on repetition to the point where basal ganglia kicks in, and we develop a new reaction, a new way of being. So just really briefly, we can spend several hours talking about this. The hypothym, pituitary, adrenal axis, you know, this is that part again, but the goal is all of these hormones are released into the bloodstream. So it's going to every cell in your body. It's not just localized in terms of I'm stressful, my legs, I need to run. No, this is in the bloodstream. It's going to every cell in your body, and it's impacting every cell in your body. So, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the outcome is cortisol, but cortisol also interferes with development. Cellular development. Cells do not divide. Cells do not grow because of cortisol. And so if a child is constantly in that, again, this is coming back to neurodevelopment and how the house comes together. I have another slide I use, but I took it out because it takes too much time to explain, but it's like building a house. The foundation of the house is usually that, well, not usually, it is that the autonomic nervous system, the brain stem. And then the next part of the brain is what they call the midbrain, where you saw in the previous slide, the basal ganglia. And then finally, the wrinkly cover that the cortex is the last part of the brain to develop. So a lot of things can shift how that house comes together or how that brain comes together. But the outcome is that there's an association to pathophysiology, to disease processes. The brain is the epicenter of all the other body systems. So if this is not working right, the chances are everything else is going to come undone. And this, again, is a disease process, whether it's inflammation or whether it's being able to calm ourselves down. or maybe we need to self-medicate with drugs or alcohol, or even if we think about it, orgasm and internet porn, or going, hooking up, as the kids call it. And really the goal is not relationships or a long-term relationship anyway. The goal is just that quick fix, just that quick, whatever brings that pleasure. And then I don't really care what happens after that. So what I'm getting at is we also have some social issues that grow out of that. Increased HIV, increased STDs, increased unwanted pregnancies that are associated with self-medication with behaviors. And I just gave the example with sexual behavior. And when I talk about the autonomic nervous system, that fight or flight mechanism is what gets activated, and just a list of everything that gets impacted, that stressors, that fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system. There is less of this. So when we go into recovery, when we go into rehabilitation, this is really what we need to start focusing on. And for me, this is the place of ceremony. This is the place of prayer. This is the place of sweat lodge, where I can begin to live a psychology based upon what I know of physiology. I begin to think about things which will also reconnect or become part of my behavior. That basal ganglia piece becomes part of my behavior, and I'm out of that, or I'm theoretically, I can move myself out of that stressful, fearful, painful environment. So, I mean, this is another example, just a little more realistic, really sort of looking at inflammation. But the nuclear factor kappa B is a DNA transcription factor, and this is the basis of that stress response system, but really sort of the effort of inflammation. There was a time in my life as a biochemist where I would isolate nuclear factor kappa B to look at the changes that occurred. The changes, what I mean by changes is that the activation of certain genes, and that's another episode of trauma, is that the epigenetic outcomes and methylation. Some of you chemists in the audience might recognize that a methyl group is a CH3. It cannot connect anymore. It's a terminal endpoint. So that's what methylation does in epigenetics. That terminal endpoint gets connected to the gene that's being formed, and it just stops. And maybe that gene is supposed to be a neurotransmitter. We have no neurotransmitter. Suppose that neurotransmitter is serotonin, a feel-good neurotransmitter. We won't have that feel-good neurotransmitter. So we're closer and closer to depression. And the closer we get to depression, we also might consider suicide. So there's a link, a scientific link to what we see in Indian country and other places around the world, and really sort of, again, the impact of trauma to become an epigenetic mechanism. And again, I just want to kind of, I had other slides. This is a double helix DNA, and what happens when we get external stimuli, external forces. By the way, every cell in your body that has a nucleus has the same doggone DNA. That's a miracle to me. Every cell in your body has the same DNA. What changes a cell, maybe a hair follicle from maybe a digestive enzyme, is the environmental influence. The influence of the environment. And again, whether it's in my stomach, whether it's on my head, certain genes will get activated. And we call that gene in science messenger ribonucleic acid, or a messenger RNA. The messenger RNA leaves the cell nucleus, and it connects to a ribosome. And the ribosome, one of the things about what holds this double helix together are what we call nucleotides. Okay, adenosine, cytosine, arginine, and I guess thymine becomes part of RNA. But there's what I'm getting at is those nucleotides form a triplet code that codes for a specific amino acid. So this specific amino acid is what we call a polypeptide. It moves on to what we call the Golgi apparatus, gets reformulated, and becomes a protein. So that's the whole purpose of our DNA, is to produce that protein. That protein, again, can be a neurotransmitter. It could be a digestive enzyme, or it could be skin particle, the part of the endodermis. but these epigenetic changes interfere with protein synthesis. And that's, I was trying to describe that methyl group CH3. I mean, it's from this, this carbon molecule can only make 4 bonds. So if there's a hydrogen, 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 and if it's connected here, it cannot make another bond there. Nothing else can connect it to it. Another, what I'm trying to say is another amino acid cannot attach to that gene and it dies. It's just a polypeptide floating around in our cytoplasm. Okay, so why is this important? Well, one of the genes that gets impacted by epigenetics is, the gene that forms a, where did I write that? Oh, I did it last night. There's a glucocorticoid receptor. And that glucocorticoid receptor, and again, this is what changes what happens to when excessive cortisol is in the bloodstream. Usually, as I mentioned, it's an anti-inflammatory and it turns into a pro-inflammatory protein because of, this gene codes for that receptor to turn off cortisol. But if that receptor is not there because of methylation, because of trauma, this continues to run, and the outcomes are there's no receptors, no way to calm down, and we see the association to aggressiveness, anxiety, depression, and I think we can see a lot of this stuff in our community. And again, my hypothesis, this is related to the intergenerational maladaptive behaviors that are going on in the family that have resulted from historical trauma. Historical trauma has gotten it started, the various forms of historical trauma. And again, I look at this is not something I read all night last night, so I can tell you about it this morning. This is actually something that I had to understand for myself. My mother and father came out of the boarding school. And oftentimes my father would talk about times when they got meat only once a week. And if the bigger kids took whatever they wanted from the littler kids. And there was only meat. I mean, there was a lot of sexual stuff that went on, a lot of aggression. And so little kids learn to fight off the big kids. And this becomes, I envision a child with a spear. You learn to just use this until you get to the point where, you're using the spear as an adult. Question. Thank you. You're welcome. I get a little excited, so I'll apologize to them. So this again is when we talk about epigenetics, that's one relationship. There are several other genes that get disconnected from making the protein that it needs to make. So, in certain places, I'm looking at the Navajo Nation, we have mortality or deaths. We have in certain places, accidents are 3 times higher than the U.S. general population. But I don't need to tell you this. I mean, we saw some statistics this morning. You come from your communities and you see a lot of this happening, where you come from. And this is really sort of what I study in the laboratory, the triangle of chronic stress. Again, there's that HPA axis, cortisol, the sympathetic adrenal medullary axis or adrenaline, but they have outcomes. And this is really what we're used to seeing in healthcare facilities, but it's hyperarousal, hypervigilance that affects our sleep. There's a concern with what we call short sleep. Short sleep for adults is less than 6 hours. If we're getting less than 6 hours, there's some things that happen. First of all, there's a balance in our adipose tissue around our waist, the fat around our waist. I'll just go ahead and say it. And that balance is that during short sleep, leptin and ghrelin get out of balance. And the bottom line is an increase in appetite. And I can't help but to think about those people sitting in the buffets that are just eating. There's the sensation or I guess it'd be a sensation of hunger is increased because of we feel sleepy. And this you might have experiences where you might feel you're not getting enough sleep, but you're kind of you're hungry. And so that is the reason why for that. But this is associated with a lot of other things, obviously, obesity, diabetes, but also during short sleep, there's the rapid eye movement portion of sleep where short-term memory gets converted to long-term memory in that hippocampus that I mentioned earlier. That doesn't happen. So if we're not getting enough sleep, we're not learning. If little Johnny Ozzie at home is up all night because mom and dad are fighting, he's not learning. He's not remembering things. So we get mad at Johnny Ozzie. Doggone it, study more, do your homework, blah, blah, blah. And little Johnny Ozzie goes home and he has to put up with this. So we see the issues here. And because school or little Johnny Ozzie and some of his his next door neighbors are not doing well in the school begins to suffer. So there's more pressure. So now we're looking at, instances or situations of what I'm a part of oftentimes, and this brings me out to schools. Often is that, we're looking at, some type of remedial action, or more importantly, trauma, what's the right term I'm looking for? Trauma-informed education. And so I'm a part of, at the University of Arizona, we're starting to look at a training mechanism that also looks at their patients. Banner is the mega health corporation, and they are beginning to pay some attention to trauma survivors, and really in part of their training system, what can we learn about what Tommy talks about, and how can we better educate our physicians so that they become aware, and they can also become to do some things in regard to helping those individuals that end up in healthcare, as opposed to just looking downstream at diabetes, looking at heart disease without that association that maybe something's going on in the community. Furthermore, something might be happening in the family. Furthermore, there's something going on that could lead to some psychiatric outcome, a detrimental psychiatric outcome that maybe leads to addiction, substance abuse, and or some disease outcome related to stroke. But I think part of the work also, these two together, chronic stress and short sleep, lead to these what we call cardiometabolic diseases. And these also are health disparities of the indigenous around the world, but specifically American Indian, Alaska Native. I got a whole mess of slides, and I apologize. So this is I don't know what the heck I'm doing in this slide, but my point is that there's a science involved. There's a biochemistry, in my connection to high school kids that we won't know this unless we begin to learn a little bit about cell structure. We learn a little bit about genetics, and this can be the new weapon, the new instrument that we take with us, or they can take with them to make change in their environments. I'm way behind with my slides, but this is a plasma, and this is really what the gold standard for looking at stress response biomarkers. And then we aliquot that or put that into littler, smaller units that we can use for different experiments. I was grateful to be part of this clinical trial that looked at the use of hyperthermia. That's just a really good word for heat, using heat to treat major depressive disorder. And so as we can see, for a couple hours, we deliver about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And this little box has infrared lamps to produce heat. And our study looked at, what is it? Can we treat depression with heat? And we certainly can. We were published in JAMA. This is, by the way, we get this idea from the Germans. The Germans use this in Germany. There's a healing process or therapy where they have these heat boxes to treat people with depression. So bottom line is the heating of the skin activates serotonin, that feel-good neurotransmitter, affecting antidepressant effect, the same neural circuits as the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So here's the science. Why? This is the paper that was produced. Sweat lodge. And I think, again, some of my colleagues kind of pat me on the back and saying, well, Tommy, now we know why there's you Indian people like to do sweat lodge. We figured it out. Hold on, Lone Ranger. That's not it. There's a psychological, a worldview component that relates to our Mother Earth, that relates also to Creator and the holy ones. And it's a psychology that lends to getting people. When we go into sweat lodge, we enter the womb of our Mother Earth. We cry, we celebrate with the prayer songs, with the drum. And it is there that the healing comes. It's also part empathy and compassion that we share with one another, as in the men's lodge, in the women's lodge. And that's part of that healing component that consists of sweat lodge ceremony. It's not totally physiological. It's not totally what happens with that's part of it. It was really funny with with our study subjects that, this is one person in the box, but that input of stimulating serotonin it's like some of our study subjects, like they had 2 shots of tequila, man. It was just like they were really just, oh, that cute guy up front, and then they would go off and talk about things that they usually wouldn't talk about because of the influence of serotonin. So this is a Navajo hogan, as we call it, our home. And so ko is that fire in the middle. This is a representation of what motivation is. We got to take care of our fire. We got to feed our fire. And so part of taking care of our fire and from a perspective or from the use of the body is this is our motivation. This is our motivation can die. Our motivation, we got to take care of that. We got to feed it with thoughts, feed it with ceremony, but ultimately optimism, hope, and encouragement. This is a talking circle, and I do talking circle, but this is really sort of the power of empathy. When you hear somebody else's story, you can't help but to connect with your story. And when you spill your story, when you tell your story, that's the healing process. Instead of that ricocheting bullet that's flying around inside you, you release it. And that's the power of talking circle. Real quick, I'm running out of time, right? She kind of let me know she's going to pull out the hook next, and then maybe there's a big guy that's going to come in and handcuff me, and then they'll take me away because I overextended my time. There's a Shamasana, yeah, my great grandmother, Bat Sosi. My work today is really influenced, if not modeled, after her teachings. I spent time from my crazy childhood home with her. And so I'm that little guy with the expanding forehead in the turquoise. His forehead's still expanding, but for different reasons. And so I always include her with my presentations. My uncle, Frank Torachini, the Navajo code talker. Some of you might know of them. In World War II, they used the language to save this country, and also the allies from influence. And so my uncle was a code talker, and the code talkers are Marines. They're badass guys. They're just they're not just slouches. But my uncle was a very gentle man. He's got his grandson in this picture. When he shook your hand, it was just a nice connection with you. He didn't have to prove how macho he is. He was there. He was that, And so I always thought about that. Man, that was really an influence to me. How could this man, carry that with him? Because he told us a story one time when I was in high school at the dinner table. He said one time they got intel that the enemy was in a hut. The Japanese were in a hut preparing. And so they put on their bayonets, him and his little battalion, and they charged that hut as soon as the sun went down, and they killed everybody inside. Only women and children were inside. So this man carries that around with him. And so that was amazing to me, the trauma that we can also begin to work through and work out. So this is really sort of I should start with this slide next time so you guys will get the full presentation. In Navajo tradition, every ceremony starts and ends with the blessing way prayer. Blessing way prayer, is this it connects these ears of corn represent various classes of ceremonies, and so blessing way connects them all. So having said that, blessing way prayer again opens and closes every ceremony. But if you listen, like I have, to blessing way prayer, it speaks of the human form, the human being, carrying in their dominant hand, tatatin, the corn pollen. Corn pollen, I should show a picture of my corn pollen pouch, but it carries the corn pollen, but it's the most sacred element. We give sacrament to the East every day. We give sacrament to those things that reconnects us with the supernatural, the power of the universe, but also grounds us to our Mother Earth. So we carry that in our right hand, and I'm moving. This is my dominant hand. In Navajo, the right hand is a dominant hand. But in our left hand, we carry the arrowhead. And the arrowhead represents you take a stand and you fight. This is not a passive process. It's not a happy thing. Sometimes we got to fight. We got to take care of those people we love. But what are we fighting for? We're fighting for the corn pollen. We're fighting for the sacredness of our land, of our children, of our people, and our communities. So this is really, again, that psychology that I wake up in the morning and I see myself in the mirror. This is what I carry with me in the science, in the laboratory, as well as out in, in a little bit more detail. Protection way with beauty way. The beauty way is represented by the corn pollen pouch. The protection way is represented by the arrowhead. And so we live our lives in this balance. And again, this is the balance and natural order my great grandmother talked about in life. Sometimes you can't just sit back and watch TV all day. Sometimes we got to get up. We got to go after things because it means something to us. We're motivated. Our fire in our Hogan is starting to die. We need to feed it. And we're at that time right now. We're just coming out of a pandemic, or maybe the pandemic's always going to be with us, but we're moving into climate change. Now's the time to begin to really look at our weapons and look at the arrowhead, because we need the arrowhead to begin to fight for our futures, the futures of our children and grandchildren. I think that's all the time I have. Are you ready to yank me off? Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I could talk about this all day.
I was about to say, we could be here all day learning about this. I'm very passionate about this. And so we thank you so much for your wealth of knowledge. And as a token of our gratitude, we'd like to present this gift to you. Is there anyone that possibly has any questions or comments for the last moment that we have? You're welcome. Emma, did you have some virtual questions?
Yes, but you still have the problem. There's a reason that they're self-medicating. And so we take care of that problem. There's no need to self-medicate. So I would go further upstream, but there are ways. Exercise. You know, one thing I do every morning with my little dog, which I didn't get a chance to talk to, but I think I'll have time to show his little picture here. I run with my dog, and my dog's had an interesting story. And there he is. This is Apollo. He was a rescue dog. He was really abused as a puppy. And so he had as he became older, that was his mode. That little kid with the spear, that was my dog. So we can exercise, we can run, we can begin to balance things out in our life. Because I think sometimes we get stuck into just responding to fear and pain. I know there's much more to answer that question, but are there any more questions virtually? Thank you very much for your attention. Have a wonderful day. It's been a wonderful conference.